Hey explorers, welcome back to another episode of Virtual MOSI. This is take 2 of our second plant lesson. Yesterday we talked a little bit about how plants are impacted by seasons. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about plant life cycles and plant reproduction. And hopefully we're going to teach you guys a little bit more about how you can have a bit more of a green thumb in your own homes. So first of all, let's talk about flowers. That's a really common type of plant, right? So flowers can have either male parts, female parts, or if they are a complete flower, both. So if you watched our plant dissection video, you might be familiar already with the stamen part of the plant right here. That's the male reproductive part of the plant. And the pistil, this one that's kind of shooting up a little higher with a little opening at the top, that's the female portion of the flower. And so the first step in a plant's life cycle, a flowering plant's life cycle, I should say, is pollination. We need to find a way to get the pollen from the stamen of the flower to the pistil of another flower. Can you think of any animals that might help in pollination? You might know bees, but did you also know that birds and bats, and even wind really, can help get pollen from one flower to another? Now in some circumstances, flowers can actually self-pollinate. But for reasons we'll get into later, that's not the most ideal genetically for the plant. And most flowers have a way to attempt to prevent that from happening. When we take the pollen from one flower to another, we refer to that as cross-pollinization. Okay, so let's say the flower is able to get its pollen from one flower to another. The next step in its life cycle would be fertilization. So the pollen would go down the stamen into this egg-like cell here and produce a seed. Now once we have a seed, we need to get it away from its parent plant somehow. And plants have developed different adaptations to do this. Some, like dandelions, use the wind, so they just are blown and dispersed throughout using the environment. Others, like say berries for example, might actually enlist the help of something like a bird or even a human to take its seed somewhere else. Now, once that seed is dispersed, if it lands in good conditions, good soil, good water, good light, germination can occur. And that's when the plant actually begins to grow from the seed. I have a few examples right here for you. This is a corn kernel actually that has not yet germinated. And then we can see right here, it started to develop some little roots reaching out for more water, more nutrients. And once it has that, it can start to shoot out a little bit right here, starting to get into that sunlight. And eventually, an entire new plant can form from that, and you have your own little seedling. So let's go back to the flowers. I said that that was an example of sexual reproduction. So what do you think some pros and cons of sexual reproduction in plants might be? Well, when we have to get other animals to help out with the pollination and the seed dispersal, that's kind of risky, right? And it takes a lot of energy. Plants often have to produce nectar to get the bees interested in coming in the first place, or maybe make the plant's fruiting part of the plant taste good, and that takes a lot of sugar as well. So it's very time intensive and energy intensive for plants to use sexual reproduction. And if it's so difficult then, what do you think some of the advantages might be? Let's think about that as we begin our next activity. So what we're going to do is just plant a few seeds from seedlings that have already germinated. It's a little messy here. A good way for you to start your own seedlings is to use an egg carton. It's a good way to recycle and also keep track of each of your individual seeds, as well as give them enough space to start out and grow. Okay, so what we're going to grow today is some turnip seeds. Okay. And I've actually already soaked them in a little bit of water so that they've started. Okay. So we've got our dirt, and we need to add some water, as we discussed yesterday. Give it some nice, good conditions there. Okay. And I've got these turnip seeds already starting, so I'll open it up for you to see those there. I've got all these nice little sprouts, and I'm going to put one in each of the little pockets. Now, if you want to, you might be able to put more than one, in case you're worried that one of them won't work or something like that. But remember that they do need their own space. So we'll just take a finger and make a little indent for each of these plants so that they can be underneath. And you might need to wait a minute to let your water actually soak into the soil. It seems like mine was pretty dry. And when you plant your seedlings, you can do this in your kitchen, at home, but remember that they are baby plants. You need to be very gentle with them. So we don't want to expose them to harsh sunlight right away. We don't want to put them out in the afternoon sun in Florida in the summer. That's not going to be good for them. So make sure you're just treating these extra carefully. And feel free, you don't need to start the seedlings before, you can just put the seeds in directly. All right, I think you kind of get the idea. So we'll leave that there. Did you think of any pros for sexual reproduction in plants? Why do you think plants are taking all that energy and effort? Well, it's because that by mixing the genes of two different plants, their offspring is going to be genetically different. It might have new adaptations that can help the plant survive new challenges to its environment. It can also really help its health and give it some new interesting traits. In asexual reproduction, that doesn't happen. And you probably have had lots of examples of this in your life. Bananas use asexual reproduction. And have you ever noticed that every banana you've ever bought in the grocery store tastes kind of exactly like every other banana you've ever bought in the grocery store? That's because bananas are clones. They are genetically identical. Every banana you eat is going to taste exactly the same. And you might notice that there's no seeds in a banana. You don't have to worry about picking them out. In fact, bananas have been cultivated to the point where they're very, very difficult, if not impossible, to grow from seeds. Only wild bananas tend to do that. And this ensures that every banana that you buy is the same. They don't have to worry about quality of the product they're selling. And the same goes for other plants as well. Oftentimes you can get seedless little cuties, little clementines, or seedless grapes, things like that. So if these plants are not growing from seeds, how might they be growing? Well, there's actually a lot of different ways. And I'm going to show you using this Pathos plant over here. We're going to take a cutting of it and use part of the plant that already exists to grow a completely new plant. So if you want to take a cutting of a plant, what you need to do is first, you're going to want at least 3 leaves. In the case of Pathos, you're going to want at least 4 to 6 inches. And you're going to look for the bottom of the leaf here. This is what's called a node. And you want to cut right at the base of that node using a clean, sharp knife or shears, because you don't want a jagged cut. And just like our flowers, we are going to try to cut it at a 45-degree angle. So I'm going to go away from me and cut 45 degrees, just like that. Okay. Now, where was I going to put this? Here we go. Okay, I'm going to plant my Pathos in soil. You can choose to plant your cuttings either in water or soil. I find sticking with one is the easiest. If you switch them, sometimes it's hard to get them to continue to propagate. So now that I've cut at a 45-degree angle right below the node, and I've got a little place that I want to put it, the last thing you need to do is remove that bottom leaf. Because there's a node there, with the leaf gone, that's going to encourage new root growth. So, simple as sticking it in. And it's really cool to do this in water as well, because over the weeks you can watch it as it grows. And within another 2 weeks or so, that should have developed a few roots, and it should be good to go. So there we go with that cutting. I also have already done that with a little bit of mint. This has been growing for a few days. And in the case of the mint, I actually didn't even take it from the leaves. I took it from a bit of root. So it doesn't necessarily have to be from the top of the plant, just anywhere that the plant can germinate from. And some plants, of course, work better with this than others. Now, apples. Bananas don't have seeds. What about apples? Well, cutting it open, we can see that there are seeds in apples. And you might have even tried to grow an apple from a seed. It's possible to do, but often farmers choose not to do this. Why do you think farmers might choose to use asexual reproduction for apples rather than sexual reproduction for apples? Well, just like with the bananas, that's going to give us a consistent product. I know that this apple tastes good. If I grow a new apple from 2 different trees, it might develop new traits, and that might be really good. Or it might develop an apple that's not as tasty to me. Farmers like it to be consistent, so they use another process similar to cutting called grafting. Whoops, losing my potato. So for grafting, what they do is they actually take a branch from one plant and attach it to the branch of another plant. And in order to do this, you need a plant that is of a similar species. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. So you could graft a Granny Smith apple branch onto a Red Delicious apple branch tree if you wanted to, but you probably wouldn't be able to graft something like an orange onto an apple tree. They have to be kind of close. So similar to our other one, I'm going to start way up here, and I'm going to use my cutting board. Take the food off of it first. Okay. So for grafting, let's pretend that I have kind of a trunk bit here and the new branch that I want to put on there. I didn't snap them, I cut them nicely with shears. So at the base of the plant, you are going to want to cut a wedge shape to fit your new plant into. And then, with your other side, you would whittle into a kind of pointed spear tip shape. Okay? And I would definitely recommend using adult supervision and better trimming utensils. Okay. But once you have that, you can find where your cut was. Kind of put them, oops. Okay, yep, you would put them together like that. Sorry there. And you would bind them up somehow, either using string or I'm going to use a rubber band today. Try to do a neater job than I did. And then to seal it up, you can actually also use wax. That's why I have this candle here. And you're going to want to put a little wax on the outside of it in order to protect those areas, those exposed places, from moisture, bugs, bacteria, things like that. Beeswax is also a really good option. Just like that. All right, while that's heating up, let's talk about some of the pros and cons of asexual reproduction of plants. So we already kind of talked about one of the pros, right? That it makes sure that we have a very consistent product, the offspring is going to be genetically identical to the parent. It's going to be the same, which is really helpful if we're talking about fruit and we want it to taste the same. And it's also really useful because it doesn't take as much energy, right? You don't have to produce all that nectar. You don't necessarily have to worry about seed dispersal and all that stuff. You can just worry about the germination. But what are some of the cons of that? Well, it's kind of the opposite of the pros for sexual reproduction, right? If you are reproducing a plant that is exactly the same and something changes in your environment, the offspring is not going to be able to adapt. It's not going to be able to have new traits, and that's a risk with bananas in particular, as recently they've had a lot of diseases that they don't have any protection from. I'm going to let your wax cool a little bit before you pour it on the plant. That seems a little hot. Okay. So in the case of bananas, it's difficult to find certain offspring that might be protected from the disease because they are all clones of each other. Okay. Grafting. Can you tell it was my first time? Okay. Now, all of this is really interesting and useful scientific information, but how can you use it in your house? Well, one of the important ways I like to use it is growing food from kitchen scraps. So this is a really good way to be sustainable. If you have some sort of lettuce or carrots or potatoes even, avocados, you can actually start a lot of vegetables that you eat at home using cuttings or different things like that. So let's start with this potato here. You're just going to want to need a cup of water. You will need a few toothpicks just to make sure that your cutting doesn't sink in. And I'm going to cut my potato into a few smaller pieces. And I'm going to make sure that every piece that I'm growing from has an eye. The eye of the potato is where if you leave those for too long in like under a cabinet or in the bottom of your fridge or something, that little shoots are going to start to come out of. That's what actually we want here. So I'm going to put some toothpicks in just to stabilize it. Make sure that there's enough water. And eventually, new roots and shoots will start to sprout from this little bit of potato. Make sure some of it is above the water and some of it is below. Now, if you're doing something like this, I've been doing this for a while with lettuce in my kitchen for at least a couple days. You are going to want to clean out the water every day, or every other day at least. That prevents bacterial growth and helps ensure that it grows nice and strong. Remember, just like your seedlings, when these are just starting out, they need kind of gentle light. And just treat them very gently. You can choose either, like I said, to plant them in water or to plant them in soil. Make sure if you do choose soil that you keep it very moist every day. You don't want it to be soaking and soggy, but you don't want it to be dry either. So a little spray bottle is a good way to achieve that. And yeah, let's talk a little bit about what we did today. So we talked about the plant life cycle, and we talked about plant reproduction. We talked about sexual reproduction of flowering plants, and we talked about asexual reproduction of a few other plants. And some plants can actually do both. Even if they produce flowers, they might also be able to use asexual reproduction. So one individual plant can take on two different evolutionary strategies. Do you remember what we said some of the pros and cons were? One big pro to sexual reproduction is genetic diversity, new traits. One con is all that energy expenditure. And kind of the opposite, right, for our asexual reproduction. We don't have that genetic diversity, but we don't have to use as much energy either. Thanks for joining us today. I hope this gave you a few ideas for how you can grow plants in your own home and how it works. Thanks for joining us, and as always, keep discovering.